So just before we launch into the topic, I'll just give you a few helpful suggestions about how to learn through the webinar. So we ask you to keep your microphones on mute. If you would like to ask a question, just simply use the chat feature. You can type in your questions and we'll keep track of those questions. And then towards the end, I'll share those questions with Rick and he can respond. So once again, at any point, if you have a question, just simply type in the question in the chat feature and we'll make sure those don't get lost. And just remember to keep your audio on mute. Now, it's really truly a joy to have you here for the first webinar that we're hosting. It's a workshop on church life cycles, which will help you identify where you're at in where your congregation is at in its life cycle, and then we'll provide you with some helpful tips on how to move from one place to another place in the life cycle. It's led by the Reverend Dr. Rick Morris, and he's one of these guys who's really hard to introduce because he's done just so much. So he has an impressive resume with over 30 years of involvement in church planting. He started 13 nonprofits working in the area of mental illness, challenging racism, and promoting civil discourse. And he's accompanied over 1,000 congregations in the work of renewal and transformation. So just has an incredible wealth of experience in ministry. And one of the coolest things about Rick is that he has 3 children, and all 3 of them have gone on to be ministers. So he's doing something right, and there's something we can learn from him. So it's an absolute joy to welcome you here, and we thank you for sharing this time with us.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. I'm glad to have this time with you as well, and I hope everything is great up in Canada. I have such great admiration for the Presbyterian Church down here in the States, but also for the work that I know is going on in the Presbyterian Church up in Canada. I think that we share a lot of commonness. One of the things that I think is really in common is that I have ancestors who came from Canada, and I have a great connection with Vancouver School of Theology, which I attended a short period of time as well, and I've just had some great times up there. Am I just on the, can we just switch me to, I can turn off my camera now, I think, and just get to the screenshot. We're on the screen view right now, am I assuming?
What I can see, I can just see the 2 of us now. There we go.
Okay.
And I'll take off the screen.
All right. Well, I'd like to talk today about life cycle of congregations, but I'd like to spend more time talking about the cycle of transformation and how churches actually work through the cycle of change. But before we get started, just a couple of introductory words. The first thing is that every human organization has a life cycle. A lot of people think that there is shame when a church dies, and occasionally a congregation will close its doors or come to the end of its life cycle. But the Apostle Paul was probably the best church planter ever, and he's experienced quite a few of his congregations that are no longer with us as well. And I think that it's important to note that every human organization actually has a life cycle. Sometimes organizations are at a high point, sometimes they're at a low point, or even subgroups within a congregation can be at different points of their life cycle at one time. But it's important to note that congregations have a life cycle. Another thing that's important to note is that many churches, when they talk about where they are in their life cycle, are not very honest about where they actually are. When we allow congregations to do self-assessment, most of the time they come in quite a bit higher than where we would actually peg that congregation in terms of its life cycle. And that's okay. It's okay. I'm an older gentleman, and I look in the mirror. I still think I'm 30 years old until I look in the mirror. The average life cycle of a church is about 80 years. When we look at congregations, particularly in North America, we see that a good many of them will go through an 80-year life cycle. In fact, we start to see most congregations that are about 60 years of age starting to experience pretty much a universal decline. Now, there is a way that that can change, and that changes normally if a church reinvents itself along the way. So with Hope Partnership, who I work with right now, we've worked with congregations that are actually 375 years old, but all of them have found significant ways in which they change their mission and their ministry, and it makes a big difference in terms of who they are. Life cycles can be prolonged, but there has to be enough pulse in a congregation. One of the things that's kind of funny is congregations almost wait too long to begin to do something about the fact that they've been in decline for a long time. And so they get to this point to where they're no longer sustainable and they no longer have resources to work with. And the membership just continues to get older and older and older. There has to be a pulse. There has to be an energy source of a congregation if it's going to reinvigorate its life. Well, I'm sure many of you have been through life cycle from time to time and have heard other people talk about this. I just want to say that we've done some different things to life cycle theory. And I think that one of the things that's important to note is that this isn't just the life cycle of a congregation. Anthropologically speaking, this is the cycle by which organizations go about in their development. And as Jen mentioned, I've done a lot of nonprofit work. I've developed a lot of other organizations. Every organization has to go through these steps of development. You can't skip a step. You can't begin in the middle of the life cycle. You've got to start at the beginning and work your way through that life cycle. So the very first thing that we see in a congregation's life cycle is energy and vision. In our work, we've worked with more than 1,000 new congregation starts and with new church planters. And one of the things that we note when we bring them into training is they don't have assets, they don't have offering plates, they don't have Bibles, they don't have any kind of music program or anything like that. But the pastor has an idea about how a church can make a difference in the lives of people that are around them. Not only does that pastor have an idea about how they might be able to do that, they have a vision about what this church is doing to make a difference in people's lives. That's the important part. It's making a difference in people's lives. And so they're energized by that. They have all kinds of enthusiasm about it. They talk about this church as being the most exciting thing you've ever heard of. And the next thing you know, as they share that, they begin to attract people to that vision. And that begins as relationships. We call this relationship because if people like each other, then they will start doing things together. But if you can't get a group of people together around a common vision and help them develop depth of relationship to where they really care about each other, you really can't move the organization into its next phase of development. Based on the integrity of relationship, then congregations can begin to develop program. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this is that program oftentimes in the life cycle of a church starts very, very informally and then becomes even more formal as time goes on. So for example, somebody will say, well, you sing pretty good, or you sing pretty good. You don't sing so good, but let's get the three of you together and you sing a special song for us on Sunday morning. That begins the beginning of a music program for a church. Or somebody will say, I see there's kids here. Why don't I take the children out and do something special with them for a while? And then the next thing you know, that's developed into a more of a formal program there. So you can't do program without the integrity of relationships. If people don't like each other, they're not going to work together to develop those kinds of things. So program becomes the next phase of development. Finally, at the top of the life cycle is the administrative phase. And that is somebody in their infinite wisdom says, it's time for us to get organized. And so when they say that, you'll notice that that's when a congregation starts to decline. We start putting bylaws in place, we put constitutions, we put budgets in place, all those kinds of things which really work and help the congregation when it's in a growing phase, but actually start to codify decline for a congregation later on. So as these things become more important, as the number of officers become important, or the number of deacons that you can get in the life of the church, or what is our financial budget looking like for the next year, as those things begin to be the most important thing, we focus away from our vision and our energy that we had, and we begin to serve our constitution and our bylaws instead. So the very first thing to go is we forget about why we came together in the first place. And as a congregation forgets about why it came together, it begins to get tired. It starts forgetting about the passion that it had about being a church that was making a difference in the lives of people and making difference in their community and in their world, to thinking about who is going to take charge of the bazaar next month. The next thing that happens is that relationships start to break down. We have competing interests about what a congregation is supposed to be, and other people have different ideas about what they think is important, and as a result of that, the relationships begin to suffer. If you don't have integrity of relationships, then the next thing to break down is your ability to do program as a congregation. The last thing that is left in the life cycle of a congregation is its institutional matters. I've worked with a lot of congregations that have closed, and I've been to church buildings. Sometimes we look at their facility to see if this is a place where we can start a new congregation or not. And it's very sad to see. You can see signs of what used to be life in a building that has gone astray because we forgot our purpose and we forgot why we exist. So I was working at a church one time in McCook, Nebraska, where I walked in on a Wednesday. The church had its final service on Sunday. They had not even bothered to clean up the communion elements. There was putrefying grape juice on the table, stale bread. The Bible was open on the pulpit to the last scripture lesson that they had read. The music book was open on the piano to the last song that they had sung in church. They just had walked away and handed the key off to somebody. And it was a sad way to see that church end. I've seen congregations that don't have any kind of music program, that cannot even afford to worship every Sunday, but they have a board meeting every month because they're tied into institutionalism of the church. So the interesting thing that we've done with life cycle of a congregation is we try to divide it into different categories and begin to work with congregations based on what quadrant that they're located in. So everything to the left of the red line is a congregation that's experiencing growth. Everything to the right of the line is a congregation that's experiencing decline. But we can also add what's called the line of sustainability. Everything that's above this line, as a congregation starts in its life cycle and begins to grow, everything on the upper side of this line is a congregation that is sustainable. But everything below the line is a congregation that's suffering with sustainability. So as you can see with the life cycle, as a congregation begins to grow, it eventually crosses a line of sustainability and begins to develop the resources and the people and the building and the facilities, all the things that a congregation needs to sustain itself. But on the decline side, there comes a line where the congregation again crosses over this line and is no longer sustainable unless they are living off the assets of a previous generation. Many congregations today are living in that fourth quadrant. So we've numbered the quadrants 1, 2, 3, and 4. And by looking at those different quadrants, you can kind of begin to see where you feel your congregation might be today. And so I'd like for us to do an experiment here and to try something as a poll question. If you would look, you've got a chat box on this, and I hope this will work. We'll see if it won't. I would like for you to just enter in on your chat box which quadrant do you think best represents your current congregation's condition. If you would name that, we'll give you about 1 minute to do that, and hopefully you'll be able to guess where you are. Just send that chat note, and we'll take a look at that. So while you're sending that in, I'm going to go on. What happens to leadership with all of these different kinds of quadrants? You know, one of the things that is fairly predictable is a life cycle of a congregation is somewhat predictable. I mean, we know that when a church starts, it's got to go through these different phases of development as it begins to go. And one of the things that I've noted, I was a former church planter myself for about 17 years, is that as a church grows and as a church begins, that it's fairly predictable the kind of leaders that you're going to first attract into a congregation. As a church matures, it becomes fairly predictable what kind of leadership is going to get in place. And then if a church starts in its decline, there's also some predictable patterns of leadership as well. So in the first quadrant, when a congregation first begins, we have a group that I like to call creative innovators that become a part of that congregation. These are people that are artists and lovers and dreamers. They've got all kinds of great ideas about how a church can make a difference in the world and how a church could be better than maybe what churches have been. They're just remarkably creative people at the very beginning of the life cycle of a church. But one of the problems with this group of people is they make lists, but they don't know where the list is any longer. They put dates on calendars, but they forget to look at their calendars. They live a fairly fluid lifestyle. And as a result of it, it makes it kind of difficult on those beginning stages to develop that into a congregation. What's great is when you can take their creative energy and begin to apply that in new ways to the world. Now, as a church becomes more and more self-sustaining, then leaders apply more of a situational leadership pattern. They coach each other when they need to. Leaders will find a way to actually help develop the skills of people so that they can lead in certain areas. Depending on where the people are that they're working with, they apply kind of the right style of leadership that's needed during that time. But the pattern that we notice on congregations that are in decline is that leadership becomes heavily transactional. That means managerial in the way in which they look at the world. So instead of being the kind of innovative, creative kind of people, what happens is they want to keep the same system going over and over and over again. They're not trying to create new systems. They're trying to manage an old system over and over and over. So if you consider this like a manager, if you think about a manager of a convenience store, they're going to keep product on the shelf. They're going to keep the doors open at the right time, close the doors. They're going to keep people staffed. They're going to keep everything going. And they're great at managing that system and keeping it going. But if the system is in decline and they apply transactional leadership to that, then what they do is they codify the decline of the congregation. That means that the church will have difficulty in breaking out of this life cycle. In fact, they will almost double down on transactional leadership style. They'll say stuff like, well, you know, what we need to do is really work hard at trying to make sure our church has more policies in place. If we just had more policies, our church would grow again. Or we begin to think about doubling down on some other things that are just as ridiculous. So the way in which you turn this around is a lot different than a lot of people used to think. We used to think that in life cycle theory that if you could just get people back to that first quadrant, get them to revision the church. Let's take our transactional leaders and let's put them in a room and let's make them write a mission statement. That'll get us back to our vision again about the future. But people forget about the fact that transactional leaders oftentimes don't have the creative ability. They're used to running the same system over and over again. So they're going to create a mission statement that states basically who they are, not what they aspire to become. And so that whole thought process really has led us to some new insights. The other part is that if we think that we can return back to the first quadrant and just revision and stuff like that, it'll make us feel better as transactional leaders, but it's not going to move the congregation into a new way of being. So what we've really discovered, and this has been helped by Otto Scharmer in his book, Theory U, is that for transformational leadership to take place, it's really more of a U process. It's about letting go in order to become something new. A lot of people think that congregational growth happens because of an act of addition, but the reality is it's an act of subtraction. It's about letting things end so that we can become something new. Now, a lot of people have trouble with this concept, and I just want to say a little bit more about that. And that is, if you were an alcoholic, you have to let go of something in order to transform your life. You have to let go of alcoholism. You have to let go of alcohol, obviously. You have to let go of perhaps some of your lifestyle issues. You have to maybe a lot of times people that I know that are suffering from addiction problems have had to even move in order to get away from old friends, to get away from old patterns and all that kind of stuff. You can't just switch to beer and think that that's going to help you with your lifestyle or help you transform. The biblical story is about letting go of things in order to become something new. When we look at the children of Israel who were in Egypt, suffering under slavery, they knew they had to let go of the reality of having a roof over their head in order to get to something new. They had to let go of being a slave or let go of the slave mentality in order to cross into the promised land and experience something new. Abraham and Sarah had to let go of their home in order to become father and mother of a great new nation. They had to let go of the idea that an old woman could have a baby in order to foster that great new nation. Jesus had to let go of his life in order for there to be a resurrection. The whole transformational stories in Scripture are all about people letting go in order to become something new. I'm sure you remember the story of the rich young ruler. When the rich young ruler comes to Jesus and he says, "What is it I have to do to have eternal life?" And Jesus says to him, "Sell everything you have and come and follow me." He couldn't do it. He couldn't enter into that act of subtraction in order to transform his life. So the biblical witness is letting go in order to become something new. Yet the church's practice is to keep adding layers and layers of program and tradition and more meetings and more things to the church calendar, thinking that that's going to lead us into a new way of being. So the transformational process really begins by naming your condition, about stating in all reality who you are as a congregation and being brutally honest about that. And that's hard because churches want to always paint a good picture of who we are. But it's important to name some things about our finances, name some things about our building maybe being too large or not used enough, to name a thing about our connection to the community and the people that live around us. Naming our condition is the first part of the transformational process. Then the second part is about redirecting our focus as leaders. Most church leaders are going to want to spend a lot of time asking two very difficult questions. The first question is, how do we get more people to come to our church? And the second question is, how do we get more money? I don't know if you've ever had any meetings devoted to those two questions or not. My guess is that you have. Those are the two worst questions that congregational leaders could ever ask, because it doesn't really get us into asking questions that have greater value, that lead to transformation. You know, any fool could fool a group of people into coming to your church. But what are we going to do that's going to make a difference in their lives? How can we help them redirect their focus in terms of what it is we're called to do? Now, the other part, and I know this is kind of controversial, a lot of people think that success for a church is based on the number of people that attend worship on Sunday morning. That's really not a measurement of success. The measurement of success is, have we made a difference in this world? And are we connecting people to God's mission in a way that brings meaning? So the next thing that we have to do is, after we get done with that, transformational leaders are always asking the question, what can we let go of? What is it that's holding us back? What is the purpose behind what we're doing? I've had churches that are incredibly committed to doing a bazaar every fall, but does that really bring people closer to God's mission? Is that something that really helps people grow in their faith? If it is, that's fine. You want to keep it. But if it's not, if it's something that makes everybody tired at the end of the day and produces very little, then maybe we need to rethink that. And a transformational leader just asks great questions. The bottom of the U is the pause. And when we get down to the pause, this is probably one of the most important things that we can do. You don't just say, this is our condition, and try to redirect our focus, and let's let go of this, and now let's be something new next week. You've got to take some time and live with that. What's it going to look like if we let go of this? What difference is it going to make that we are acting in a new way? We need to reflect on that. Just a side note, one of the things that we work with in congregational life is we're working with a lot of churches right now that are selling their buildings and relocating and moving to other parts of their community where they have a greater chance of having a big footprint. And one of the things that we try to do with congregations is move them to a place of pause. And that is move into a place that's in the target area where they think they're going to go, but not put down roots, not make a big investment, not build a building right off the bat, but to try to get used to doing ministry there and have that inform what you're doing. Then you begin to crystallize what that future might look like for the congregation, and you begin to get better and better ideas about that, and then you move right directly into prototyping as a congregation. So the prototyping part is a real important part of this. So the thing I just want to say is a congregation does not need to be stuck. It doesn't need to just live forever, whatever part or whatever quadrant it is in its congregational life cycle. A congregation can move fluidly through that process, and it's important to do that. The second thing is writing a mission statement is only going to please transactional leaders, but it's not going to lead to transformation. That the kind of work that a congregation needs to do when we get through that transformational process is to engage its imagination and to begin to imagine a story about what the church might look like in the future. Stories have tremendous power in terms of working congregations into new ways of being. And then moving back to growth may require the fact that there might be some losses in that. Sometimes we've heard of congregations losing a key elder or a key leader in the congregation who's been nothing but kind of a bully in the congregation, and how the congregation takes off after that person leaves, after they've endured years and years and years of their abuse. Shifting congregational orientation usually requires some help from the outside. It's a lot of congregations think, well, we can work this out ourselves. We can work our way into a new way of being. But what we've discovered is that congregations are just a little too close and not as honest about it as people from the outside can be in working with a congregation. We see congregations that we work through in very many different programs and services that we offer move very quickly to new ways of being. And finally, you cannot transform a congregation unless the leadership of the church is transformed. It's hard to move a congregation into a new way of being unless those of us who are leading that congregation are also open to a new way of being for ourselves. I think congregational transformation is some of the most challenging work that any leader can be engaged in the life of a congregation. It's so much easier to let the church remain where it's at and to remain doing the same thing over and over again, possibly expecting different results. But the reality is that our role is to never be satisfied. Our call is to always move people to be the best that they could be in terms of getting close to God. Well, I've talked quite a bit here, and I was anticipating that maybe we could have some conversation as a result of that. That was an awful lot of stuff to throw at you at one time, but I'm hoping that you've had some questions and some contacts. So Jennifer, have you got any questions or comments?
Nothing yet, but I'm sure something will come in soon. So everyone is invited to write in your questions. We did get a number of responses when you did the poll, and it seems like most people are in the third or the fourth quadrant. Great,
that's good to note. And one of the things that's interesting is in some of the research that I've done with different denominations down here is only about 17% of our congregations are in the first or second quadrant. And that the vast majority of congregations are on the decline side. And of course, there's a lot of data that I've read that seems to codify that as well. And it's unfortunate when congregations are on the decline side that they fail to recognize that, or they don't want to talk about it. It's kind of the dirty elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. Great, thanks for that polling for information.
So we've had a question come in. The question is, how do you encourage new leaders to come forward, especially if you are in a gentle decline with relatively few new members?
That is an excellent question. First of all, it's the older leaders that set the tone for this. And one of the things that's kind of hard is that sometimes our well-established leaders in congregations don't want to let go. And that makes it really kind of difficult working in congregational dynamics. They say they want new leaders, but they're not really willing to empower new people to lead in a different way. This is kind of offshoot story, but I like chasing puppies. We had one time, we had a new person coming to a church I was serving, and she had come, this was only about her second Sunday, and she volunteered to make cookies for the coffee hour of our church. Now, if you're a pastor of a congregation, that's pretty exciting when you've got a new person that's starting to engage your church. But when you have a new person starting to come to your church that volunteers to do something, especially making cookies, that's really, really a cool deal. Well, I was given the benediction at the end of the service, and I overheard kind of a loud conversation going on in the fellowship space of our church. And I went back there, and one of our longtime older members was giving our new person a lecture on how she placed the cookies in the wrong part of the table for the coffee hour. Now, world peace is going to end if you don't put the cookies in the right place on a table. I realize that. And this lady was just kind of having a fit about the fact that she wasn't doing it right. Well, if you're going to empower a new leader to do something, you need to give them the keys and let them operate the way that they need to do. And so one of the first most difficult parts of that is to, first of all, get current leaders to let go and to let people learn their own way about, or to find their own way in terms of what it is they're trying to lead. Another part that we find is kind of hard about this is if you don't have new energy within the life of the congregation, it's really difficult to develop people that you don't have into leaders of the church. And sometimes people want to develop, you know, you'll get a person that visits your church, and the second Sunday you're making them the chairman of the congregation. You know, you don't want to move people too quickly into leadership because for one thing, you'll scare them to death. But for the other part is, you know, it's just maybe they need to learn more about the culture of your congregation before they get into leadership. So with the trick is engaging new people in ways, giving them the opportunity to practice leadership in a way that maybe is not as consequential at first, and then moving them into greater levels of leadership. That's probably not a very good answer, but I just have to say that most of the time the issue is our existing leaders not letting go more than new people trying to step up into the plate.
Thank you. We've had a question come in with a request to explain a little bit more what the pause looks like, and just flesh out that part of the you a little bit more.
That's a great question. The pause is a spiritual discernment period. And for those of us, Theory U, Otto Scharmer, the guy that developed this, is actually a Buddhist. He's a German and theorist that works at MIT, Massachusetts Institute for Technology. But the process here is really the Christian story of redemption as well. When we look at biblical characters and we look at people, we see that oftentimes during a period of loss, it brings you to your knees. At a time of great personal crisis, we find ourselves really turning to God. And the pause is really a way of signifying that. It's about being honest about what's going on in your situation, but then being prayerful about that and living with that for a while, letting it sink in. So I think maybe one of the greatest examples of that, if you study art, you'll notice that Chinese art is quite a bit different than Western world art. In the Western world, we're trying to capture every piece of the the subject that we're trying to paint. There's sometimes a great deal of emphasis on realism and trying to capture lighting angles and all that kind of stuff. But with Chinese art, the artist doesn't bring their canvas to the view. They just look at it. And they might come back a second day and look at the subject that they're trying to paint, and a third day and look at the subject. That's kind of what the pause is about. And then after they sit down, they madly work into painting it from memory back in their studio. That would be what prototyping looks like. So it's really an interesting way of looking at this. It's about taking enough time to let it sink in, praying to God, asking God, how can you intersect our lives and what can we do about this? And putting that passion in your heart to become something new. If you move too quickly to change, and this is one of the things that's really hard for those of us that love to change things, if you move too quickly to change, you don't bring everybody along. And sometimes you don't really crystallize for yourself what it is you want to change into. You're just doing something different. So if we're making adaptive change, which is deep change, that means we have to take some time to really pause and think about it. Thank you for your question.
We've had a couple of other questions come in. One of them is a congregation that's experiencing decline starts to become fearful and is resistant to change. And then how do you shift from a space when people are feeling fearful, how do you move into a space where you can engage imagination and you can start to tell stories? So how do you introduce that kind of a process?
Yeah. Wow. I didn't know these were going to be such good questions. You know, a lot of times you're absolutely right. When a congregation is in decline, it gets fearful. And the more fearful it gets, the more crazy things that the church starts to do. And if there is a high level of anxiety, then you will see churches do some really crazy things. I'm working with a congregation right now. I won't tell you where it's at, but it has a 60,000 square foot building. That's a very large building. It was built in the 1930s. It needs about $2 million worth of work in order to keep the building open. When they turn on the boiler, it costs $100 an hour to heat the building. And that's just the sanctuary, $100 an hour. And the other part about it is the sanctuary seats 1,500 people and the church averages 25 to 30 people. They had a developer came by and offered them $16 million for the property. And this group is so afraid of leaving that beautiful sanctuary that they can't even begin to imagine what it would be like to live life in a different place. They're struggling financially. They can't even begin to imagine what it would be like to do ministry with $16 million in your pocket. And so one of the things that there's a great book out called Immunity to Change. And this is something that a leader really needs to begin to grapple with. And that is, how much complexity can your congregation handle? In this particular case, they can't handle very much complexity. They need things drawn very simply and very clearly for them. And then they need to have some time to imagine. We can't force them into voting on this. We can't force them into making a decision. We have to give them enough time to challenge their fear and to begin to work with that and to name that fear as something that is very real for them, and to not make fun of their fear, but to acknowledge their fear as being a real thing. And so just like working with a person who is dealing with some sort of loss in their life and the meaning of that, this kind of work takes some time with a congregation. It takes some skillful ministry from the pastoral leader to work with. But you don't get there by not acknowledging that there's fear. You don't get there by pretending it doesn't exist. You have to name it. You have to continually name the condition of the church, not to make people anxious, but so that we can do something about it. One of the things that's interesting about fear is that when you're afraid of something, if you hear a noise in the basement and you're not sure what that is, you can stay upstairs and keep the door closed and pretend like nothing's happening. And that isn't really a healthy way of dealing with the fear. You need to kind of open the door and go down and see what's going on and check things out. And so it's about helping the congregation find the courage to face their fears and to move into that. The other part is that a lot of times fear of a congregation is fear of failure, and that this church is going to end on their shift, or this church is going to get itself in a place where it cannot function any longer. And I think the reality is that I've seen some congregations take huge beatings and still sustain themselves. Congregations are much more resilient than people think they are. I never will forget when my daughter was about 2 years old, she fell down a flight of stairs and I thought she probably broke every bone in her body. And we went down there and grabbed her, and yeah, she was crying. But the reality is when you're 2 years old, your bones are made out of rubber, I guess. But she came out just fine. In fact, she was kind of giggling before we got all the way back upstairs. There's a greater deal of resilience in congregations than we think they really actually have. And they can deal with it, but as long as we're not naming the fears and not naming the thing that we're most afraid of, we're never going to move our congregation into a new way of being.
Great. What word of advice would you offer to a minister, who understands this moving through the U and wants to engage in that process with her or his congregation? What practical advice would you give for implementing these strategies?
Yeah, I think it would be great if you could work with an outside resource to do that. One of the first things is, as a pastor, you have a different relationship with the congregation than an outside resource person could be. Now, I realize that sometimes there's fees involved in that and people can't afford that, but outside help is normally a really good way to deal with it, because they can come in, dump a load of stuff on a congregation that makes them think, but you're there to process with them, to help them process through the whole part of transformation and change. We do a lot of assessments of congregations. We've had a lot of congregations that say, we don't need to work with you. We're going to do this on our own. And yet they always gravitate back to thinking about this as being a church growth issue or something like that. It's good to have outside resource people that can help you get through the process, just like it is with anybody that's dealing with a personal issue that they need to deal with. The second thing I would say, though, is if you are going to try to do it yourself, you have to get the right people in the room. And one of the things that we normally do as a church is we get our most faithful, loyal people together as part of the team that's working on this intentional transformation for our church. And unfortunately, those are mostly transactional leaders. They're very loyal people. They're good people. Some of my best friends are transactional leaders. But they're not going to have that infusion of creativity that you need in that piece of the puzzle. So you need to have in the room people that are your biggest naysayers, the guy that always sits back and says that's not going to work. You need to have that person in the room. You also need to have some people that are like under 100 years of age that have some energy and some enthusiasm about what the church could become. And you need to engage them in civil conversation with each other and facilitate that kind of conversation so that they can begin to think about the future. And then not just think about what it is we want to do or setting goals or objectives, but to begin to think in metaphor about what the future could look like in that congregation. So much of the time people want to put things in institutional language, and it's really hard to conquer institutional kind of dynamics that way. But by putting it in a good language like a story or some sort of metaphor where you're creating images of positive things that are happening as a result, that begins to work the creative side of your brain. I wish I had more time to work with you, but a lot of times we're working out of the dominant side of our brain, which is the least creative side, trying to do the creative work out of the wrong side of our brain. When we're working in story and imagery and even artwork or other things like that, we use the creative side of our brain, and that allows us to imagine a church more along the lines of what I think God has really called us to do.
Great. Just a quick aside. Once I was working with a congregation doing a visioning exercise, and I had the congregation write postcards as though it were 5 years in the future, and they were supposed to write to a friend telling the story of their congregation then in the 5 years into the future. And it was a really good way to engage that sort of creative process and got people telling stories. So I think that kind of is a really important one. We got one comment in, maybe some practical advice for a congregation that is so stuck in its ways that even the minister one Sunday didn't wear a collar and it caused an uproar. How would you suggest this congregation starts?
Yes. Boy, I don't even know how to begin with that. I talked to a pastor the other day. There are some people that don't believe that the gospel has anything to do with doing anything new, and that this is the way that the church has always been, and we should always be this way. And if we do anything differently, like if you don't wear your collar, then all heck will break loose. I think you have to introduce innovation very carefully to a congregation. You know, a lot of churches fight worship wars over musical style, and they think that perhaps the organ is the only source of music that's acceptable in worship. When the reality is, I was an organ major in college. In fact, I was a classical trained organist and played the pipe organ. I love pipe organ music. I have, if you look at my iPhone, I've got pipe organ music on there I love to listen to. But I also realize that when you go to Best Buy, there's nobody lined up at the organ music bin buying music. That's just not the way people are wired today. And a lot of people don't realize that the organ, when it began, the first place that Christians heard organ music was in the Colosseums in Rome, in the Roman Empire, when they were being sacrificed to lions and other things like that. That the origin of organ music was not as a liturgical instrument, but a sidebar of music that could be played while somebody was getting their arm tore off by a lion. And so it wasn't until the Middle Ages that organ music became popular in the life of a church. And that was because we built these large cathedrals, and the only way to fill a large volume of space with sound was through the technology of an organ, which was the best technology that we had at the time. Well, there are many other instruments now that are available that can be used in large volumes of space that can produce music. And I have to say, as a musician, that having a great variety of music is something that I value and think highly of, that there's more than one way that we can do that. So introducing other forms of music to a congregation is a sample of how you begin to help a congregation begin to work with change. You don't change everything at one time. You just change a little bit as you go through, and you begin to show them that they don't die from incremental change, and that that they have a greater resilience for change than maybe they even think they do. The other part is that I know of a congregation where a pastor wanted to introduce video technology in worship, and met nothing but very severe resistance to that from the congregation. And so he finally went back to the congregation. This was a very skilled pastor, and he said to him, he said, you know what, I don't want to use this in worship, but once in a while when we're doing a funeral service, people like to have pictures of the deceased projected on the wall. Would it be okay if I got a projector just to use for funeral services? And they reluctantly agreed to that. And then a few months later, he said, you know what, it's Grandparents' Day coming up. Wouldn't it be nice if we could project pictures of grandchildren on the wall? Well, everybody loves to see pictures of their grandkids on the wall. So yeah, that would be fine. Well, the next thing you know, after slowly making some introduction, they were able to incorporate that in a broad stream of things. So you start slow, you start little, you start incremental. You remind people we didn't die as a result of that, and help them find the way to get into doing that. Your church is not likely worshiping the way that it did 100 years ago. Your church probably is very different than what it was, and you have administered change for a long time, and you have capability for dealing with change. And it doesn't mean you're right or people are wrong. It just means we can do things differently and maybe better and relate to the people that are near us.
Great. We've had a question come in that reads, what are the most important things church leaders can do to help a pastor if both are committed to renewal and missional change?
Wow, that's a great question too. Well, first of all, I can't say enough about our pastors of our congregations. They are dealing with a total different landscape than pastors of any previous generation have had to live with. And the thing that I find is remarkable is the way in which these pastors are so deeply committed to their calling that they're willing to do some of the things that they're doing. So one of the things I think that's important for lay people is to pray for our pastors. and to let them know that we support them and that we are on board with them to do that. The other part is lay people in a congregation can do things that a pastor can't do. Lay people can be actually more transformative leaders than the pastor can be in a congregational setting themselves. And lay leaders can actually set the table for change. Sometimes our best lay leaders are what we call bridge builders. They're people that keep transactional leaders and transformational leaders both in the game. They keep them both engaged. They let people know that they're hearing their concerns, but they help other people see the importance of listening to each other through the process of change. I think if you have lay people in a congregation that are equally committed to change or committed to even congregational transformation, that is one of the best gifts that any congregation could have, and that would help it. I also have to say that sometimes, in all honesty, the biggest deterrent to change is the pastor. Sometimes the pastor doesn't want anything to change. They're the ones that are working towards keeping everything the same. And if that's the case, then there's a different role for lay leaders in that kind of situation to help the pastor gain their courage to be a transformational leader as well.
That's great. Just wondering, we're called to ministry at a difficult time, and the people who are gathered are either ministers or congregational leaders. It's a challenging time, and the role, the model of transactional leadership is attractive because it's safe in a way. How do we prepare ourselves? How do we open ourselves to be different types of leaders in this day and age?
Oh, that's a great question too. We do full workshops on development of transformational leaders, and the transformational leader, it would take a long time than I could, much more time than I could take at this moment to answer that. But I think the important part is that there has to be, first of all, an awareness of the kind of leadership style that you use mostly now. And not everybody is wired to be a transformational leader. But recognizing the gifts of your leadership style to the whole situation, but creating space where there's an openness for transformational leadership to take place is a job of all kinds of different leaders. There's actually 38 different leadership styles that are mentioned in graduate studies that I've taken on leadership. And the thing that's important to note is that transformational leadership is only one of 38 styles. And that not everybody has to be a transformational leader, but the process of transformation is something that everybody can commit to regardless of their leadership style.
Great. So we just have a few minutes left, and I was wondering if you could just make some quick closing remarks about offering a word of hope to those gathered in this webinar, and a word of encouragement for the next steps that they'll be taking as they go back into their congregations.
Yeah, well, I am hopeful about the future of the church. I always have been. I've been in ministry 44 years, and I've seen a lot of changes. I've seen flagship churches crash and burn and things like that, but I am basically very hopeful. And the reason I'm hopeful is because of people that are still deeply committed to the church. And they're not just committed to the church, they're committed to God's mission. And I think that's the important part that people need to keep in mind. I really believe God has a purpose for us all on earth, and that God wants to see us live in true harmony and peace in this world. And that God has called us out to be his hands and feet and to work in this world in ways that make a difference. And I know that as long as there are people that are committed to that, that the church is going to persevere. I think the church is going to be very, very different. And one of the things that I think I see happening all across the board is congregations beginning to understand that they're not institutions, but they're living communities of faith that are called into the world to connect people to God's mission in ways that are powerful and meaningful. And so when I look at the future of the church, I think congregations are probably going to be smaller in numbers, but I think they're going to be actually doing a lot more. I've seen congregations of 20, 30 people turn complete communities upside down. I have seen small congregations provide mission and ministry in ways that people could not begin to imagine. I saw a small church in North Idaho that created a program that won an international award for humanitarian efforts, and that congregation was only 60 people. So I think that it's not congregational size that makes a difference. It's not how much money you have in the bank. It's not how big your building is. It's about connecting people with God's mission to make a difference. And I think that there's a passion for that in this world. And I think there's a passion for connecting with that. So I'm very hopeful about the future of the church. St. Augustine had a great statement about hope. He said that hope has two beautiful daughters. The first daughter is anger at the way things are. And the other daughter is the courage to do something about that. As long as we're courageous people and we understand that God walks with us each and every phase of the way, I really believe our churches can make a difference in the world and the place that we've been planted. So I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you, Jennifer, for allowing me to be a part of this. And I pray God's blessing on you all.
Well, thank you so much, Rick. I've had a comment come in that I want to read to you. It reads, great answers and helpful information. Thanks so much, Reverend Dr. Rick, for helping us all. Praying for hope and renewal.
All right.
Yeah, so this has been really incredible, and just so grateful for this. The webinar has been recorded, and we'll try to make it available online later so that people can tune in again and share it with colleagues, because the information here is very helpful. And just a reminder to all the congregations out there, if you're looking for more information about congregational life cycles, if you're looking for information about how you can renew and transform in your congregational ministry, you're invited to contact Canadian Ministries at any time. We're here to walk alongside you and to support you in your ministry. So I want to make that resource available to you, and know that and make sure that you know you can contact us at any time. This is the first of many webinars that Canadian Ministries will be hosting. Our next one is on November 8th, and it's a webinar on discernment, and it will be read by the Reverend Dr. Tim Archibald from King's Presbyterian Church, and he'll be explaining how to go through a discernment process where your congregation engages collectively in listening for where God is calling you next in your ministry. So once again, a huge word of thanks to all of you for joining us for this webinar, and especially to Rick for leading us. You've given us so much to think about and so much to work with, and we're very grateful. All right. Hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon.